Hello everyone. Well, getting ready to start part two. Um, we'll be playing a little Tchaikovsky today. But alright, last time, after witnessing the battle between the toys and the mice, Marie ended it by throwing her shoe towards the Mouse King if it hit it. But while she was lying up in bed afterwards, Godfather Drosselmeyer arrived and teased her with a story about how the Nutcracker came to be and how ugliness came into his family. Alright, so we begin with Chapter 8, The Story of the Hard Nut. Perlipat's mother was a king's wife. That made her a queen, and the moment she was born, Perlipat was a princess. The king was beside himself with joy over his beautiful daughter who lay in her cradle. He cheered and danced and hopped about on one foot and shouted over and over again, "Hurrah! Has anyone seen anything as beautiful as my little Perlipat?" And all his ministers, generals, counselors, and staff officers hopped about on one foot like the sovereign and shouted, "No, never!" And indeed, it was undeniable that no more beautiful child than Princess Perlipat had been born since the world began. Her little face might have been woven of the finest lily white and red rose silk, her eyes were sparkling like azure stones, and her curly locks were like thread through gold. What's more, little Perlipat was born with 2 rows of pearly white teeth, with which, 2 hours later, she bit the Lord Chancellor's finger when he bent low to get a close look at her features, making him scream, "Oh, Jiminy!" But it was also claimed he just said, "Ouch!" On this score, opinions are divided to this day, but Perlipat definitely bit the Chancellor's finger, and the whole kingdom was delighted that his indication that spirit, energy, and perspicacity were housed in Perlipat's exquisite little frame. In short, everyone was happy. Only the queen seemed troubled, though no one knew why. For one thing, she arranged for Perlipat to be closely guarded. In addition to the sentries at the doors and 2 ladies in waiting sitting close to the baby's cradle, there had to be 6 nurses in the room at night. But what seemed utterly absurd and beyond understanding was that each of the 6 nurses had to hold a tomcat on her lap and stroke him so busily all night that he would never stop purring. Dear children, you couldn't possibly guess why Perlipat's mother had to take all these precautions, but I know, and I'll tell you why without delay. On a certain occasion, a number of excellent kings and charming princes had foregathered at the court of Perlipat's father. Brilliant entertainment was provided in tournaments, comedies, and balls. To show that he had adequate supplies of gold and silver, the king had to decide to dig deep into the royal treasury and put his guests to something really splendid. When the royal head cook informed him that the court astronomer had informed him that the time was right for her pork butchering, the king would resolve to provide a sumptuous sausage feast. He hopped into the carriage and drove about, personally inviting all the kings and princes to a simple spoonful of soup, as he put it, for he wished to enjoy the surprise. And he said airily to the queen, "You know, my dear, how I like sausage prepared." The queen knew exactly what he meant. He meant that she herself should perform the useful duty of sausage making, and she had done on other occasions. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was ordered to remove the big golden sausage kettle and the silver casseroles from the great treasury vault and send them to the kitchen. A great fire was made of sandalwood. The queen put on her damask apron, and soon the kettle was steaming with delicious sausage broth, whose fragrance penetrated even to the council chamber. Overcome with delight, the king could not control himself. "Just a moment, gentlemen," he cried, and ran to the kitchen, hugged the queen, and stirred the kettle for a moment with his huge golden scepter. That calmed her and went back to the council chamber. The critical moment came when the fat had to be cut into small cubes and browned on silver spits. The ladies in waiting withdrew because the queen, out of love and respect for her warrior husband, wished to perform this task alone. When the fat began to sizzle, a faint whisper was heard. "Sister," said the voice, "give me some of that. I'm a queen too, and I too want something good to eat." The queen knew what it was. It was Madame Mousefinks, who had been living in the royal palace for many years and claimed to be related to the royal family. She called herself the Queen of Mousolia and had a large retinue under the stove. The queen was a kindly woman, though unwilling to acknowledge Madame Mousefinks as her sister. She was glad to let her share in the feast. "Very well, Madame Mousefinks," she said. Come right out. Of course you may have some of my crispy fat. So Madame Mouse Hanks came hopping out, jumped up on the stove, and with her pretty little paws, grabbed one little cube of fat after another as the queen forked them out to her. Then all Madame Mouse Hanks' aunts and uncles came running, even her 7 sons, who were dreadful little rascals. They flung themselves on the fat, and the terrified queen found it impossible to fend them off. Luckily, the head lady in waiting came in and chased the intruders away before the fat was all gone. Of course, mathematician was called in, and what was left of it was carefully divided in accordance with his calculations. Drums rolled and trumpets blared. The princes and potentates appeared in their resplendent robes of state, some in white palfreys, others in crystal coaches. Crown on head and scepter in hand, the king welcomed them and took a seat at the head table. During the liver sausage course, the king became visibly pale, and his eyes turned heavenward. Sighs escaped from his breast. Some unspeakable pain seemed to be gnawing at his vitals, but during the blood sausage course he sobbed and groaned and slumped in his chair, burying his face in his hands. Everyone jumped up. The court physician tried in vain to feel the unfortunate king's pulse. Some deep, mysterious suffering seemed to be tearing him to pieces. Drastic remedies, feather quills and the like, were attempted. The queen pleaded with him to tell her what was wrong. At length, he seemed to recover a little and murmured almost inaudibly, "Not enough fat." In despair, the queen fell asleep, sobbing. "Oh, my poor unfortunate husband," she cried. "Oh, what sufferings you have endured! You see the culprit here at your feet. Punish her severely. Alack, alas! Madame Mouse with her 7 sons and aunts and uncles ate the fat." And with that, the queen fell back in a faint. The king turned over the rays and cried, "Chief lady in waiting, how this happened?" The chief lady in waiting told him as much as she knew, and the king resolved to avenge himself on Madame Mouse and her family, who had eaten the fat that should have been in the sausage. The privy council tried for her life, and that all her property should be confiscated. The Privy Council was assembled, and it was decided that Madame Mouse should be tried for her life, and that all her property should be confiscated. But since the king feared that she might go on eating his fat in the meantime, the whole matter was referred to the court clockmaker and wizard. This man, whose name was the same as mine, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, promised to drive Madame Mouse and her family from the palace forever by an act of astute statesmanship. What he actually did was invent a certain ingenious machine so its small pieces of fat were attached by threads and placed them all over Madame Mouse's apartment. Madame Mouse was far too shrewd to be terrorized by Drosselmeyer's contraptions, but all her warnings, all her remonstrances were in vain. Lured by the pungent smell of brown fat, all 7 sons and any number of aunts and uncles went straight to Drosselmeyer's engines of destruction. When they tried to nibble the fat, a gate suddenly fell and they were captured, whereupon they were taken to the royal kitchens and ignominiously executed. Gathering what was left of her family, Madame Mouse left the scene of her cruel loss. Her heart was filled with rage, despair, and thirst for vengeance. The court rejoiced, but the queen lived in fear, for she knew Madame Mouse like a book, and felt sure her she wouldn't take the death of her sons and relations lying down. True enough, Madame Mouse appeared in the kitchen just as the queen was cooking kidney stew for her husband, who was especially fond of that dish, and said, "My sons, aunts, uncles, and uncles have been slain. Take care, your highness, that the queen of the mice doesn't bite your princess in two. Take care." With that, she vanished and was seen no more, but the queen was so frightened that she dropped the kidney stew in the fire. That was the second time Madame Mouse had ruined one of the king's favorite dishes, and it made him angry. Well, that's enough for tonight. I'll tell you the rest another time. Much as Marie, who had ideas of her own about this story, begged Godfather Drosselmeyer to go on, and he sprang to his feet, saying, "Too much at a time would be good for you. I'll tell you the rest tomorrow." As the judge was leaving the room, Fritz asked him, "Tell me, Godfather Drosselmeyer, is it really true that you invented mousetraps?" "How can you ask such a silly question?" said Mrs. Stahlbaum. But the judge smiled strangely and said, "Do you think an ingenious clockmaker like me would be incapable of inventing a mere mousetrap?" Okay, I forgot to grab some water, so I need to hop out and go get some. Ooh, hop over to archive.org and take a look at some of these illustrations here. So on to chapter 8, Story of the Hard Net continued. Now, children, Judge Drosselmeyer continued the next evening. Now you know why the Queen had the beautiful Princess Perlipat guarded so closely. Can you blame her for being afraid that Madame Mousewings would carry out her threat and bite the princess to death? Drosselmeyer's machines were of no use against the wily Madame Mousewings, but the court astronomer, who was at the same time the privy astrologer, argued that Purr and Tomcat and his family had the power to keep Madame Mousewings away from the table. Accordingly, each of the nurses had to hold a sign of that family, a whole lot of liberal employed at court as legation secretaries, on her lap, sweeten his arduous duty by diligently scratching his back. One night, at exactly 12 o'clock, the lady in waiting, who was sitting close by the cradle, was startled from a deep sleep. All was quiet round about. Not a purr could be heard. In all that deathly stillness, you might have heard the woodworm nibbling the wainscoting. Imagine how this lady in waiting must have felt when she saw a big, ugly mouse standing up on its hind legs with its hideous head right on top of the princess's face. The lady jumped up with a cry of horror, waking everybody else. But at that moment, Madame Mousewings, for the big mouse beside Perlipat's cradle, was none other, squatting in the corner. The legation secretaries ran after her, but too late. She had vanished into a crack in the floor. Awakened by the noise, little Perlipat cried pitifully. "Thank goodness she's alive!" cried the nurses. But what was their horror when they looked at Perlipat and saw what had become of the lovely, delicate child. Instead of the angelic red and white face framed in golden curls, they saw an ungainly fat head on a tiny, shrunken little body. The azure blue eyes had been changed into her staring green pop eyes, and the sweet little mouth had become a gash stretching from ear to ear. The Queen almost died of grief, and the walls of the king's study had to be covered with cotton batting because he kept ramming his head against them, wailing in a pitiful voice, "Oh, what an unhappy monarch I am!" He might have realized by then that it would have been better to eat his sausages without fat and leave Madame Mousewings and her trunk in peace under the stove. But that wasn't how Perlipat's royal father's mind worked. He put all the blame on the royal clockmaker and wizard, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer of Nuremberg, and issued a decree giving Drosselmeyer 4 weeks to restore Princess Perlipat to his former state, or at least suffer a surefire means of doing so, in which he should suffer a shameful death at the hands of the royal executioner. Drosselmeyer was terrified. But then, trusting his craft and in his luck, he did what seemed to be the first thing to do. He skillfully took Princess Perlipat apart, unscrewed her hands and feet, and examined her inner structure. Unfortunately, he discovered that the larger she grew, the more hideous she would be, and he could think of no remedy for it. So he carefully put the princess together again, and sitting beside her cradle, which he was not allowed to leave, he sank into the deepest gloom. The 4th week had already begun. Indeed, it was already Wednesday of that week when the king, his eyes flashing with rage, looked in, shook his head with all his might, and cried out, "Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, you're the princess, or you are dry." Drosselmeyer wept bitter tears, but Princess Perlipat just cracked nuts. For the first time, the wizard was struck by Perlipat's unusual appetite for nuts, and also noticed that she had come into the world with teeth. The fact of the matter was that immediately after her transformation, she had begun to cry, and she had cried until a nut happened to come her way. And twice she had cracked the nut and eaten the kernel. That calmed her, and from then on her nurses had thought it wise to keep her supplied with nuts. Oh, holy natural instinct! Oh, eternally inscrutable sympathy of all beings, cried Christian Elias Drosselmeyer. Thou hast shown me the door to the secret. I shall knock at that door, and it will open. He asked leave to take counsel of the court astronomer, and it was brought to him under heavy guard. The wise men embraced and wept and embraced, for they were dear friends. Then they withdrew to a secret chamber and consulted numerous books dealing with instinct, sympathies, antipathies, and other mysterious things. Night fell. The astronomer gazed at the stars, and without Drosselmeyer, who was also versed in such matters, drew up Princess Perlipat's horoscope. This was no easy matter, for the lines of her destiny crisscrossed and tangled, but at last, oh joy! At last it was clearly revealed that all Princess Perlipat had to do was to throw off the spell that made her ugly, and to recover her beauty was to eat the sweet kernel of the nut Krakatuk. The nut Krakatuk was so hard to shell that a field howitzer could ride over it without cracking it. This hard nut had to be cracked in the princess's presence by the teeth of a young man who had never shaved and never worn boots, and this young man would have to handle the nut with his eyes closed and not open them until he had taken 7 steps back without stumbling. Drosselmeyer and the court astronomer had been hard at work for 3 whole days and nights. That Saturday the king had just sat down to his noonday meal when Drosselmeyer, who was scheduled to be beheaded on Sunday, burst joyously into the room and announced that he had discovered the way to restore Princess Perlipat's lost beauty. The king embraced him rapturously and promised him a diamond sword, 4 medals, and 2 new Sunday coats. I expect you, he added affably, to get to work right after lunch. Just see to it, my dear wizard, that an unshaven young man in shoes is on hand within that Krakatuk. And don't give him any wine to drink beforehand, because we don't want him stumbling when he takes 7 steps backward like a crab. Afterwards, he can get as drunk as he likes. The king's words filled Drosselmeyer with consternation. Trembling and quaking, he explained to the king that though the means had been revealed, both the nut Krakatuk and the young man who could crack it with his teeth remained to be looked for, and it was doubtful whether Nut and Nutcracker would ever be found. The king, in a towering rage, swung a scepter over his crowned head and roared with the voice of a lion, "In that case, we'll go through with the beheading!" Luckily for the terrified Drosselmeyer, the king had enjoyed his lunch most especially that day, and was therefore disposed to heed the sensible advice that the magnanimous queen, who was touched by Drosselmeyer's plight, did not fail to give him. Drosselmeyer took heart and argued that he had indeed discovered the means by which the princess could be saved, and therefore deserved to have his life spared. "Stuff and nonsense," said the king. But after downing a glass of schnapps, he decided that the 2 of them, the clockmaker and the astronomer, should set out and not come back until they had the nut Krakatuk. The man who was to crack the nut would, as the queen suggested, be found through advertisements in the local and foreign papers. Here the judge broke off again and promised to finish the story the following evening. There's some more of Bertald's illustrations. Right there they have Princess Perlipat being dismantled. Alright, on to chapter 9, the story of the hard net concluded. The candles had just been lit the next evening when Godfather Drosselmeyer did indeed arrive in Marie's room and resumed his story. Drosselmeyer and the court astronomer had been traveling from place to place for 15 years, and still they had discovered no trace of the nut Krakatuk. Children, I could spend 4 weeks telling you about all the places they went, all the strange and unusual things that happened to them, but I won't. Instead, I shall tell you only that Drosselmeyer was sick at heart and longed for his beloved native city of Nuremberg. One day, when he and his friend were smoking wretched tobacco in the middle of a large forest in Central Asia, Drosselmeyer was quite overpowered by homesickness. "Oh, Nuremberg," he cried. "Oh, Nuremberg, my happy home, how foolish I have been to roam, and how I yearn to return to Nuremberg, my Nuremberg, where all the houses have windows, and the churches all have doors." As Drosselmeyer kept lamenting and lamenting, the astronomer, overcome with sympathy, began to moan so pitifully that he could be heard all over Asia. But after a while, he pulled himself together, wiped his tears, and said, "Dear, dear esteemed colleague, why do we sit here lamenting? Why don't we go to Nuremberg? What difference does it make where we look for that wretched Nutcracker?" "You've got something there," replied Drosselmeyer, and heaved a sigh of relief. They both arose, knocked the ashes out of their pipes, and headed straight for Nuremberg. They had barely arrived when Drosselmeyer ran to his cousin, the carver, varnisher, and gilder of dolls, Christoph Zacharias Drosselmeyer, whom he had not seen for many years. The clockmaker told the doll-maker this whole story of Princess Pirlipat, Madame Mousestrings, and the Nutcracker. The doll-maker clapped his hands in amazement and cried out, "Cousin, cousin, cousin, how perfectly wonderful!" The clockmaker also related the incidents of his long journey, how he had spent 2 years with the King of Dates, how the Prince of Almonds had rudely turned him away, how he had vainly consulted the Natural History Society in Squirrelville. In short, how he had nowhere found the slightest trace in that Krakatoa. While listening, Christoph Zacharias had several times snapped his fingers, twirled about on one foot, and clicked his tongue. In the end, he exclaimed, "Good gracious, heavens above! I can hardly believe it." Then he tossed his cap and wriggled into the air, hugged his cousin with all his might, and cried out, "Cousin, cousin, you're a made man! Because if I'm not very much mistaken, the Nutcracker is right here in my house." Whereupon he brought in a box, opened it, and took a gilded, medium-sized nut. "Here it is," he said, "and now let me tell you how I came by it. Many years ago, at Christmas time, a strange man came here with a sack full of nuts that he was trying to sell. Right outside my shop, he got into a fight with a local nut seller, who felt very strongly the stranger had no business selling nuts in our town. So the stranger put down his sack, and just then a heavily loaded cart came along and rode over it. All his nuts were cracked except one, which the vendor offered with a mysterious smile to sell me for 17.20 20 cruiser piece. He looked in my pocket, and to my great surprise, found just the coin the man wanted. So I bought the nut and gilded it. I can't imagine why I paid so much for that nut and why I prized it so highly. Every last doubt about its being the precious Nutcracker was dispelled when the court astronomer scraped away the gilt and found the word Krakatoa incised in the shell in Chinese characters. The travelers were overjoyed, and the doll-maker was the happiest of men when Cousin Drosselmeyer assured him that his fortune, too, was assured, since, in addition to a sizable pension, he would be supplied with gold for his gilding as long as he lived. The two travelers, the wizard and the astronomer, had already put on their nightcaps and were getting ready for bed when the astronomer spoke as follows. "Esteemed colleague, one piece of good fortune and never comes alone. Take my word for it, the Nutcracker isn't the only thing we've found. We've also found the young man who's going to crack it between his teeth and give Princess Pirlipat the beauty kernel. I'm referring to none other than your cousin's son." And his enthusiasm, he protested, "No, I will not go to bed. I mean to drop the young man's horoscope this very night." With that, he threw off his nightcap and set to work on his observations. True enough, the cousin's son was an affable, nice-looking fellow who had been shaved and had never worn boots. In his younger days, to be sure, he had been a jumping jack for a Christmas or two, but all trace of that had vanished, for since his father had taught him proper behavior. Now, at Christmas time, he wore a sword and a red jacket with gold trimmings, and since he carried his hat on his arm, there was nothing to hide his magnificent pig-tailed rig. There he stood in his father's shop, gallantly cracking nuts for young ladies, for which reason they called him Nutcracker. Next morning, the astronomer threw his arms around the clockmaker and cried out, "It's him! We've got him! He's found! But there are two things, my dear colleague, that must be borne in mind. First, you must make your excellent nephew a sturdy wooden pigtail, connected with his lower jaw in such a way that a tug at one sets the other one in motion. Second, when we return to the palace, we must take care not to tell a soul that we have brought the young man who is cracking nut with his teeth. In fact, he must not show himself until we have been there for some time. I ran the horoscope that after a few others have broken their teeth trying to crack the nut, the king will promise the princess and his throne to the man who succeeds and thereby restores the princess's lost beauty." Cousin Dollmaker was so delighted to hear that his son was going to marry Princess Pirlipat to become a prince and a king, and that he entrusted the boy entirely to the care of the two travelers. The pigtail that Drosselmeyer attached to his hopeful young nephew was a complete success, and thanks to this device, the boy was able to crack the hardest peach pits. Drosselmeyer and the astronomer sent word to the palace that the Nutcracker had been found, and advertisements were put in the papers forthwith. By the time the travelers got there, several handsome young men, including one or two princes, had arrived determined, thanks to the soundness of their teeth, to free the princess from the witch's spell. The travelers were aghast when they saw the princess. The little body with its tiny hands and feet could barely support the ungainly head. The ugliness of the face was accentuated by a wide, hate cotton beard that spread over her mouth and chin. Everything happened as the astronomer had read in his horoscope. One beardless and bootless boy after another broke his teeth and jaws on the Nutcracker took, without doing the princess the least bit of good. When carried away, the semi-conscious by the dentists who were in attendance for the occasion, they sighed, "That is indeed a hard nut to crack." The king in despair then promised his daughter and kingdom to the man who would break the spell, whereupon the gentle and well-bred young Drosselmeyer stepped forward and asked to cry. None of the young men who had made such an impression on the princess. She pressed her little hands to her heart and sighed ever so fervently, "Oh, I do hope it's he who cracks the nut and becomes my husband." After young Drosselmeyer had graciously saluted the king and queen and Princess Purple as well, the Lord High Chamberlain handed him the Nutcracker took. He put it between his teeth, gave his pigtail a good tug, and crack, crack, broke the shell into many pieces. Adroitly removing a few fibers from the kernel, he handed it to the princess with a low bow, closed his eyes, and took a step backward. The princess swallowed the kernel, and wonder of wonders, the misshapen monster was no more, and there stood the loveliest of maidens. Her face was woven of lily white and rose-red silk. Her eyes were glittering azure stones, and her head was piled high with curled threads of gold. The drums and trumpets mingled with the rejoicings of the populace. The king and his whole court danced on the floor, as they had at Puddlepat's birth, and the queen, who had fainted for joy, had to be wed with cologne. The tumult was most upsetting to young Drosselmeyer, who had still to complete the 7 steps backwards. But he kept his head, and was just raising his right foot to the 7th step when Madame Mousefinks arose from the floor, piping and squeaking hideously. And putting his foot down, young Drosselmeyer stepped on her and almost fell. Oh, cursed fate! A fraction of a moment later, young Drosselmeyer was as ugly as Princess Purlipat had been. His shrunken body could hardly support the monstrously swollen head with the big turbulent eyes and the wide, hideously yawning mouth. In place of his pigtail, and now a narrow wooden cloak with which to move his lower jaw. Both the clockmaker and the astronomer were beside themselves with horror, but then they saw Madame Mousefinks on the floor, writhing in her blood. Her wickedness had not gone unavenged, for young Drosselmeyer's toe had struck her so sharply in her neck that she was doomed to die. But in her death agony, Madame Mousefinks squeaked in a most heart-rending manner, "Oh, Crackatuck, hard nut from which I die! Hee hee! Pee pee! You too, Nutcracker, will perish by and by. My son with 7-fold crown will bring Nutcracker down. Yea, never fear, he will avenge his mother dear. Oh, life, blood red and milky white, I leave thee for the shades of night. Squeak!" I'm sorry, my cat had jumped out of a box door, knocked out of the closet. It'll be okay, you didn't make a mess. I'm just gonna have to pick that up. With that last cry, Madame Mousefinks expired. He was carried away by the keeper of the water stoves. No one had been paying attention to young Drosselmeyer, but then the princess reminded the king of his promise, and he gave orders to bring the young hero in. When the poor fellow appeared, thus disfigured, the princess held her hands before her face and cried out, "Oh, take him away! Take that nasty Nutcracker away!" Without delay, the royal bouncer seized him by his little shoulders and threw him out the door. The king was furious at this attempt to palm a Nutcracker off on him as a son-in-law. He put all the blame on the clockmaker and the astronomer and banished them both from his kingdom forever. This last development was not in the horoscope that the astronomer had drawn up in Nuremberg, but that did not discourage him from making further observations, and he ran the stars that the young Drosselmeyer would make the best of his new situation, become a prince, and the king lived despite his ugliness. But the horoscope continued. He would cast off his ugliness only if he could kill the son whom Madame Mousefinks had born after the death of her 7 sons with their 7 heads, and if he could win a lady's heart in spite of his ugliness. And it seems that young Drosselmeyer, as most recently seen at his father's shop in Nuremberg, is a Nutcracker, but also Prince. That, children, is the story of the hard nut, And now you know why people say that was a hard nut to crack, and why it is that nutcrackers are so ugly. The judge had finished his story. In her opinion, said Marie, Princess Perlipat was a horrid, ungrateful minx. Fritz, however, thought that if Nutcracker had an ounce of spunk, he would make short shrift of the king of the mice and get his good looks back. Alright. Go through the illustrations by Bertal here. Chapter 10, Uncle and Nephew. If any of my esteemed readers or listeners had ever a chance to cut himself on glass, he will know how painful it is and how wretchedly long such cuts take to heal. Marie had to stay in bed for almost a week because she was dizzy whenever she got up. But after a while, she felt better and was able to run around the house as merrily as ever. The toy cabinet looked lovely with its fresh new toys and houses and dolls. And what pleased her most of all was seeing her beloved Nutcracker, who stood on the second shelf and displayed an excellent mouthful of teeth when he smiled at her. But then, as she was feasting her eyes on him, she suddenly realized to her consternation that Godfather Drosselmeyer's whole story had been the story of Nutcracker and his battle with Madame Mouserings and her son. Now she knew that her Nutcracker could be none other than young Drosselmeyer from Nuremberg, Godfather Drosselmeyer's charming nephew, who, unfortunately, had been transformed by Madame Mousering's magic. But even while listening to the story, Marie hadn't doubted for one moment that the skillful clockmaker at the court of Pat's father was none other than the judge himself. But why didn't your uncle help you? Why didn't he help you? She lamented as it became clearer and clearer to her the battle she had witnessed had been a battle for Nutcracker's crown and kingdom. Hadn't all the other dolls been his subjects? And wasn't it sure as anything could be that the court astronomer's horoscope had come true and that young Drosselmeyer had become king of the dolls? As clever Marie pondered all this, thinking of the Nutcracker and his subjects as living and breathing, it seemed to her that they ought really to live and breathe. But they did nothing of the kind. The inhabitants of the toy cabinet remained lifeless and still. But now, far from going back on what she staunchly believed, she blamed the lifeless condition on the magic spells of Madame Mouserings and her seven-headed son. But never mind, she said aloud to Nutcracker, even if you can't move or say the least little word to me, Mr. Drosselmeyer, I know you see into my heart, and know how devoted I am to you. Count on my help if you need it. At the very least, I'll ask your uncle to help you with his skill when necessary. Nutcracker didn't budge, but it seemed to Marie that the gentlest of sighs came to her almost inaudibly, ever so sweetly through the glass panes. That little bell-like voice sang to her, "Dear sweet Marie, protectress mine, thou who standest by me, and all be thine." Marie took a strange pleasure in the cold shivers that ran down her spine. By then it was dusk. Dr. Stahlbaum came in with Godfather Drosselmeyer, Louise at the tea table, and soon the family was sitting around it talking pleasant things. Marie quietly pulled up her little easy chair and sat at Godfather Drosselmeyer's feet. In a moment, when none of the others were saying anything, she looked straight into the judge's face with her big blue eyes and said, "Dear Godfather Drosselmeyer, now I know that my Nutcracker is your nephew, young Drosselmeyer from Nuremberg. He became a prince, or rather a king. It all came out just as your friend the astronomer predicted. But you certainly know that he's at war with Madame Mouserings' son, the ugly king of mice. So why did you help him?" Marie went on to tell the whole story of the battle as it looked to her, and was often interrupted by the laughter of her mother and Louise. Only Fritz and Drosselmeyer remained unsmiling. "Where on earth did she get such crazy ideas?" asked the doctor. "Oh," said Mrs. Stahlbaum, "she has always had a lively imagination. Actually, I think it's dreams brought on by her fever." "I don't believe it," said Fritz. "My red hussars can't be such cowards. They'd hear from me if they behave like that." But Godfather Drosselmeyer, smiling strangely, picked Marie up on his lap and spoke to her more gently than ever before. Ah, my dear little Marie, you're luckier than I or anyone else. You were born princess like Perlipat, for you were of a fresh and beautiful country. But you will have much to suffer if you mean to befriend the poor misshapen Nutcracker, for the king of mice will beset him wherever he goes. But there's nothing I can do. You alone can save him. So be steadfast and loyal. Neither Marie nor any of the others knew what Drosselmeyer meant by these words. Indeed, Dr. Stahlbaum thought them so strange that he felt the judge at his pulse and said, "Dear friend, you are suffering from cerebral congestion. I'll write you out a prescription." But the doctor's wife shook her head thoughtfully and said, "I have an idea what the judge is getting at, but I can't quite put it into words." Okay, I know this is shorter than yesterday, but I'm going to cut that off there, and maybe tomorrow I'll be reading the last 4 chapters. Thank you for tuning in.